Hey guys, welcome back. This is going to be part 4 of chapter 3 of the book that we've been doing so far. The Sickness is a System, When Capitalism Fails to Protect Us from Pandemics or Itself by Richard Wolff. Hope you guys have enjoyed this so far. I'm hoping to possibly get in chapter 3 today. We'll see. But other than that, let's get back in. So John longevity, seniority, promotion, household stability, etc. Poverty, disrupted households and families, unaffordable housing, education, and medical care would haunt such a minority. It would become capitalism's business cycle shock absorber. The last hired, first fired across the 4 to 7 year average duration of its cycles. For capitalism, making such a minority absorb most of the cost of capitalism's instability allowed the majority of the working class to be relatively exempted, relieved, freed from them. The majority could be less subject to cycles because the minority was made relatively much more subject. Capitalism promised the majority relatively secure jobs and incomes because it took those away from the minority. The majority could thus worry less about the next cycle, whereas the minority had to worry more about and adjust their lives more. Racists could then attribute the resulting differences between minority-majority subparts of the population to inherent inequalities of different races instead. Other advanced capitalist countries found parallel solutions. Some condemned immigrants to play the role assigned to African Americans in the United States. Racism aimed at immigrants often followed. In cyclical upswings, immigrants would be brought in, North Africans into France, Southern Italians into Switzerland, Turks into Germany, and so on. Then, cyclical downswings would return those immigrants to their home countries. Capitalism would thus save on cost of unemployment insurance, welfare payments, etc., for the workers who had returned, while some capitalisms relied on domestic minorities to be shock absorbers, and others relied on immigrants. Some countries relied on both. The United States used Central American immigrants alongside domestic African Americans, and still does. Germany allowed some immigrants to settle and acquire German citizenship alongside Turkish and other immigrant guest workers. In the United States, married white women also play the role of business cycle shock absorber. During cyclical upswings, they would enter the paid labor force in part-time or full-time positions. Like African Americans, they earned less than white men. Women's jobs, too, were likely to be temporary, undone by cyclical downturns. Whatever communities were forced into the shock absorber role, poverty, depression, broken family slums, and inadequate housing, education, and health facilities became more widespread among them than they were among the majority of the working class. Insecure jobs, incomes, homes, and lives often bred bitterness, envy, desperation, crime, and violence. These collateral damages had to be managed by the capitalisms whose survival depended on producing and reproducing those communities. Police and prisons were and are assigned that management task. Police and prisons were to quote, keep the lid on, tame, patrol, and control the restive portions of the shock absorber communities, sequestered in slums or ghettos. Interactions with police coupled with cycling and recycling through prisons were the chosen means to manage capitalism's collateral damage. Those means generated collateral damage of their own. The long, tragic record of police violence, use of excessive force, the harshness and violence of incarceration, and the killing especially of African Americans. Why were African Americans chosen to be key, but not the only, cyclical shock absorbers in the United States? One factor concerned the racist legacies of U.S. slavery. They included benefits that slaves were either not fully human nor inferior humans. Even the U.S. Constitution had counted a slave as merely 3/5 of a full, i.e. white, person for census purposes, also known as the 3/5 Clause. Accommodation to slavery before the U.S. Civil War had already shaped a racialized consciousness in both masters and slaves. And because U.S. slavery entailed different skin colors for masters and slaves, unlike many slaveries in world history, a readily identifiable minority had already been defined in racial terms in the slave portions of the United States. Moreover, that definition had spread to other parts of the United States as well. U.S. capitalism used, absorbed, and built on slavery's legacy by inserting large portions of the African American community into the shock absorber role that the system required. the racism developed by U.S. slavery thereby both facilitated U.S. capitalism and was reinforced by it. A significant portion of the white working class in all capitalisms has always also been forced into the shock absorber role. White trash in U.S. capitalism was never far from the African Americans similarly situated. There thus arose possibilities of class solidarity between these black and white working class communities. U.S. history displays moments when those possibilities were realized, as C. Van Woodward documented so well. It also displays moments of intense racist violence used to block the realization of those possibilities. Employers played on racialized differences to keep employees from unifying against them. And bitter competitions between black and white shock absorbers for cyclical, scarce jobs, whites could, and often did, use racism to gain advantages and access to those jobs. In multiple ways, then capitalism fostered and benefited from racism, and thus settled deeply into the system. Fundamental injustice characterized the relationship between police and prisons. On the other hand, in the African American and other communities, indigenous people of color, condemned to play capitalism's shock absorber role. On the other, the solution was and is not better training or more funding. Both have been tried repeatedly, and both have likewise failed repeatedly. A real solution would provide a decently paid job to everyone who wants one as a matter of right. Unemployment would then be outlawed, much like slavery, child abuse, etc. Taxes levied on capitalist enterprises would provide the funds needed to find jobs, private or public, for those laid off by an employer, much as such taxes help fund unemployment insurance now. Those funds would include wages or salaries paid for each worker's time being laid off and rehired. Minimum wages, applied universally, would cover reasonable housing, transport, health care, and other living costs. If such a solution were deemed to be incompatible with capitalism as a system, capitalism would have to give way to a system that made adequately paid employment a basic right for all. Enterprise profit would then finally be ejected from its throne as capitalism's number one social priority. Such a solution would finally free African Americans, indigenous, and brown people from long-standing abuses in and by police and prisons. It would thus reduce the racism that those institutions have exemplified and reinforced. It would also reduce pressures on police and prison personnel to behave in ways that self-destructively rob them of their humanity, as well as oppress others. Police and prisons in the United States today serve an inherently unstable capitalism by means of systemic racism. The logic of alliance between anti-racism and anti-capitalism could not be clearer. Onwards. Brick and mortar, crumbling. The COVID-19 pandemic has cemented Amazon's dominant position. What now? Quote, all the lonely people, where do they all come from? So what are the Beatles famously? Today's answer would be from isolation in front of computers. In recent years, millions of customers have lost interest and abandoned malls across America. Not to mention more traditionally brick and mortar storefronts that make cities like New York so vibrant. Well before the coronavirus hit, many commercial strips had been reeling and malls had been collapsing into bankruptcy by the thousands. Shoppers increasingly saved money, and by ordering from home via the internet and getting package deliveries, when did they venture out? It was often to big box stores. During the last few months, huge numbers of small stores have closed. Walmarts and Targets have been opened, and online shopping has been even more widespread, accelerating an Amazonification of America that had already been underway. What do we do about this will largely determine whether we still have functioning public commercial space in the country, or whether we fold up our tent and accept that relatively efficient and inexpensive delivery of our goods straight to the home will dominate our retail economy for generations to come. The answer matters mightily. Many have forgotten this, but markets are not just places where we go to get our goods. They are defining characteristics of civilization as we know it. Once, isolated households were self-sufficient in most ways, each producing what it needed to survive. Then, a division of labor slowly evolved. People learned that when each household produced just one or fewer products, a community of households could achieve a greater total output of goods and services. that enabled higher standards of consumption and living. To achieve them, communities needed some institution, a council of elders, a chief, a religious or secular leader.